crazy year all over the world. It's been also a crazy year for us in Wild Ventures and the entire cybersecurity community. I think that I don't have to tell anybody's here what a crazy year the cybersecurity industry experienced. I can tell you from our perspective, been super busy. We've done 3 new investments. I think that all of our new portfolio founders are here, so thank you for joining us. Our existing portfolio companies grew significantly, lots of follow-on rounds. So it's been a very good year for Wild Ventures for us, and it wouldn't have been possible without you, the Israeli ecosystem, and our partners in the US, including the panelists that you're going to hear about soon. So I would like to express our gratitude and thank you everybody for being here and for supporting us. All right, so without further ado, let's start the panel, and I would like to hand over the mic to Mr. Andy Ellis, operating partner in our firm, former CSO of Akamai. Andy, take it from here.
Thanks, Ofer. And I'm going to bring up my panel, and so I don't botch everybody's names. We'll have everybody come up at once. So thank you all for coming out today. I'm going to start by having each of our panelists introduce themselves with just a brief bio. No, like 20 minutes, Sounil. And that way you'll have a feel for where their answers are coming from as we talk about some of the challenges that are in the security market today. So we'll begin with Sounil.
Sure. So, hi, I'm Sounil Yu. I'm the former CISO-in-Residence at Wild Ventures. It's a wonderful job and a wonderful opportunity. I'm currently the CISO at JupiterOne, and before that, I was the chief security scientist for Bank of America.
And remind us what JupiterOne does.
JupiterOne is a cyber asset management platform.
Thanks. Wendy.
Okay. Hi, I'm Wendy Nather. Stop that. I started as a CISO. I worked for a Swiss bank and then for state government in Texas. I've been an analyst for 5 years. I ran the security practice at 451 Research, where I met a lot of you, I think. Last time, I helped to stand up the retail ISAC, the Intelligence Sharing and Analysis Center, and now I lead a team of advisory CISOs at Cisco.
And for those of us who aren't familiar with Cisco, remind us what they do.
Yeah, we make the bits go.
Hi there. I'm Ryan Gurney. I'm the new CISO-in-Residence for a while. I took Sunil's job. I was formerly a CISO at Google in a division of Google, CISO at Looker, which is a data analytics platform, and then the first CISO at Zendesk, which is a customer support platform.
Thank you.
Hey everybody, Ariel Tseitlin. I'm a partner at Scale Venture Partners. We're thrilled to be co-hosting this with YL. And this, for very first, at least for me, and maybe for you, conference since RSA in 2020, which is awesome. Scale Venture Partners is an investor that's based in the San Francisco Bay Area. We invest in early in revenue enterprise software companies that are ready to scale, hence the name. My own background is largely on the operating side. I won't bore you with all the details, but my last role was at Netflix, where I was in charge of building out the cloud platform team and the streaming operations group, and then got recruited into Scale to invest into infrastructure. And I thought it was going to be just infrastructure, but then I made the mistake of telling them that I know a little bit about security, and then I became the security guy at Scale too. So a lot of my investments have been security, but I don't pretend to be a CISO.
Excellent, but you are a chaos monkey.
That's right.
Excellent. So Wendy, I want to start with tossing you a question, because you talk to a lot of CISOs, probably more than the rest of us combined on a regular basis. So what do you find to be the most burning challenges that CISOs are currently facing?
Wow, the most burning challenges. You know, it sounds like you would think that there would be new challenges, but as far as I can tell, a lot of them are struggling with the same things, the same classic things that we call the basics that actually aren't very easy. And of course, you know, things have been more difficult to carry those out in the last year or so, but there's no real science project that, you know, they're turning their attention to. They're still trying to do the basics.
Okay, anyone got a commentary on that? Difference, agreement?
No, I think if you look at all the kind of the ransomware stuff that we've seen, it kind of highlights that some of the basics are still not in place, right? Which is pretty depressing for what we spend on security, actually.
Well, I want to take that ransomware question then, and let's run with that. Because ransomware campaigns today feel a lot like DDoS did about 10 years ago.
You just ransomware with that.
Well done. So how doomed are we, and not just from ransomware, but from Wendy's puns? And so what should CISOs be focused on to tackle this challenge?
So your question is, how is ransomware different than DDoS? I would say categorically, they're actually not, in that the way I characterize a ransomware attack, it's a recovery-oriented attack, something that undermines our ability to recover. A denial of service is also one that hinders our ability to recover. One operates on the network domain, DDoS. Another one operates on the data domain, ransomware. I think we're basically seeing the first signs of recover-oriented attacks that undermine our ability to recover. So beyond just data-oriented and network-oriented attacks, we're going to have situations where we can't recover our endpoints because our firmware is bricked. We're going to have situations where applications can't be recreated, or rather, it's gotten to a point where we can't deploy our application again because our code has been completely wiped out. Okay, so I think there's going to be situations where there's additional escalation on this front to get to a point where we have trouble recovering from these types of catastrophic, irreversible events.
That sounds pretty doom and gloom there.
I'm an optimist.
And you're the well. Actually, I think Ariel has to be the optimist. So I want to see if Ariel's got a solution for us. Like, is there something you're excited about in this space from an investment and scale perspective, or is there something else you think that startups should be focused on from a science project perspective?
You're asking about ransomware specifically?
If you've got a ransomware, or if you want to just dodge that and go to somewhere else, I'm not going to hold you hostage.
I can tell you a couple of interesting companies I ran across that deal with ransomware specifically. I won't share the names, but their approach was actually fairly novel, where what they were doing was taking every endpoint and treating it as a /32 network. So essentially isolating every endpoint on its own. And obviously you can imagine the management nightmare of dealing with all of those subnets, and that's their magic. And so their claim is, even if you get ransomware on any of your endpoints, it's not going to be able to travel anywhere because it'll have to talk to them in order to move, and they'll be able to identify that. So that was an interesting, clever solution. But then in terms of broader themes in security that I'm excited about, there's a couple of areas that I've been spending time that I think are interesting. One is there's been a crazy amount of startups that have been founded in the last couple of years that try to deal with a compliance problem in a new way, where a lot of the companies that probably founders here are founding need to get that SOC 2 stamp in order to have validation and approval from customers, and now there's a whole bunch of companies that give that to them. That I don't think is very interesting or exciting, because I think that's going to be commoditized. But then taking that and then thinking about how that expands into what the next version of GRC looks like, where you're actually able to bridge what the compliance needs are with what the security needs are in a single platform, which I know you laugh, but that's been the promise for decades. And I think in the next decade, I'm hopeful we'll deliver on it. So that's one area that's really interesting. And then another area that's very interesting is identity, and specifically around managing, I think authentication, Duo, kudos, and Okta and others, I think did a wonderful job with the authentication problem. But the authorization piece is still, very, very complex. And it's not just because it's a complex problem, it's because we don't have frameworks or platforms to build that on top of. So that's another really interesting area within identity.
I only laugh about the GRC compliance security issue because I had to build my own technology to do it only for us. And so I'm still waiting for someone to solve that problem.
Most CISOs did.
Yeah. Ryan, like when you're talking to startups, because you've probably been the most CISO places, like what is the filter that you use when talking to them, either from a product or a people perspective, that makes you say, like, this is a startup that I'm interested in working with?
Yeah, I think it first comes down to how they approach me and my team, but also the founders, their passion for what they're doing, and is it going to solve a core problem that I have? So I think about it from can I replace a tool or multiple tools with this? Do I need to hire more people to manage this, or is this going to allow me to reduce potentially my headcount? And then is it something that's innovative that I can scale with? At the companies I was with were very SaaS oriented. It has to scale, and it has to be able to manage to the scale and growth we're experiencing.
Mine's easy.
Yeah.
I use the cyber defense matrix.
For those of you not familiar, Sounil is the author of the Cyber Defense Matrix, so I'm glad at least he uses it. But there was something you said in there, Ryan, that you said it depends on how they approach me, that I actually do want to tease apart, because we got a lot of people who are startups here, and so I'm going to ask everybody, because all of us have been buyers, so I want everybody to give me one thing that a startup should never do in approaching a potential buyer. What's the worst thing or the one thing you tell people, don't ever do this?
I would say go above my head. I don't appreciate that when they go to the CEO or the board, and I get pressured from the board or the CEO to use the product.
Yeah, when I was an analyst, I would talk with startups, and I'm going to have to be honest here, because most of the Israeli startups that I would talk to said, we are the first or we are the only to do something. And that just made me want to prove you wrong. And 9 times out of 10, I could. So don't approach with that line. Yes, let me decide, either as the analyst or as the buyer, whether I've never seen this before, and I'll be honest if I do.
I would say my number one would be, don't claim that I will get breached if I don't use your product.
I hate that one.
Yeah, and I have a twist on that, which is don't show me where my breaches are without me giving you permission, right? So don't go and scan everything and tell me here's where everything is broken, because that generally doesn't work.
I was going to go with a variant of that one, which is don't tell me you've done it, but that you'll only show me if I take the meeting. Like, if you're going to tell me I've got a problem, just tell me what it is. Okay, thanks. Because that's an important one. Like, startups need to get their foot in the door and not slam it on them. So let's come back over to Wendy, and Ariel talked about sort of automating GRC down, which means there is some innovation to be had there. But what are the other places when you think about automation that in cybersecurity operations should really move out of the people space and into the technology space?
Oh, that's a good question. It's my feeling that automation works best when it is specific, when it's transparent, and when it has commitment. In other words, you have to be very, very specific as to what you want the automation to do, and you've got to be very sure that you want it to do it all the time. You can't, go in and say, no, we didn't want it to do that. And there's a lot of exceptions that have to be handled in a real-world organization. It has to be transparent. Everybody has to be able to understand what that automation is supposed to do, what inputs it's taking, what it's basing its decisions on, and then you have to have commitment. You have to be able to set it and let it run, because if you're coming back to mess with it every couple of weeks, it's not really automation.
Yeah, to add to that, I actually proposed an automation, like a decision framework for when it's okay to automate. So it has several of the points that Wendy had. The way I stated it is, it's tightly scoped. It's the transparent piece in terms of just knowing what you're automating in the context of being very deterministic. You know what's going to happen and what the decision points are. There's accountability if something goes wrong. And anyway, there's all these different pieces that I've captured to talk about. When is it okay to automate? And one of the other key pieces that I would also add is it needs to be reversible. So if you're going to automate something, make sure you have something that allows you to reverse it as quickly as possible.
Hang on, I got to take some notes here.
Just look at the cyber defense matrix and you'll be good. So 2020 was an interesting year in a lot of different ways. And I think some people think it was very transformational, and some people think it was just a pause. So for each of you, what's your take on that? Like, Sounil, we saw, ransomware, big breaches, SolarWinds. Like, do you think that's going to cause a change? Ariel, do you think there's a change in what people are going to invest in and what scaling needs are out there? So sort of everybody sort of take their pivot on how does 2020 affect the rest of the decade?
Well, I think, what have we seen, right? I think we're starting to see people come back to work a little bit, but work is going to be different. This idea of remote work is going to stick around for a while. And from a CISO standpoint, that's probably a good thing. We need to move to that direction. I think you're all probably challenged by recruiting talent. If we can disperse talent, it's probably better for technology in general. But I think that's an area of remote worker and remote locations and broader locations where our data is that we're going to have to tackle more.
I don't think it changed anything, honestly. I don't think anything new is happening now that wasn't happening before, but I think that certain trends got accelerated massively. That's one, right, that you mentioned, which is the remote work, and you've had companies like Google, for example, right, that was already doing zero trust and all that for many years. Now everybody's got to deal with it. You've had digital transformation that every CIO was tasked with for the last decade, and they were kind of taking their slow time doing it. And after COVID, that just shot through the roof because they couldn't access their data centers anymore, and they had to most of them moved to the cloud. And so I don't think any new trends were created, but certainly the acceleration of those ones that have been going on for some time happened, and I think that's something that's going to stay.
I think there's a massive change underway simply because of the fact that everybody had to go home and work remotely. Almost all of the network security controls used to be in the data center, and you would assume that almost all traffic started there. Now everything is tromboning from wherever the end user is into that data center and then back out again to a SaaS application, and that's just too much latency. And so SASE was born, the idea that, okay, let's take these same controls and the network service and let's move it out to the cloud so we can move it to POPs that are closer to where our users are. I have a feeling that's still not going to be enough because organizations that want to control the entire network stream and all the security are still going to be seeing latency. But that you don't have to do that with everything. You can perform end checks without having to control the network. And if you let that part go, then the latency is not as much of a problem. So I think we're going to see architectural changes that are based on this problem.
So about 6 years ago, I made a prediction that the 2020s would be the age of recover or the age of resiliency. This was 6 years ago. So 2020s, one of the first things we face is a worldwide business continuity and disaster response activity that fortunately wasn't as catastrophic as it could have been. And so I believe that we are all stronger as a result of this recover-oriented activity that we've done. And whether it's ransomware, whether it's coronavirus, whether it's DDoS, every time that we face these types of opportunities to learn from how do we respond, how do we recover from these types of events, we all get stronger.
Okay, so I think one of the things we sort of ducked around in talking about that was the third-party risk. And I think SolarWinds, I think every CISO I know had to go tell their board, we don't use SolarWinds. Right, that was the audit everybody did. And I remember asking at the time, I said, SolarWinds isn't the big risk, it's the other vendor just like SolarWinds that you're not asking about. Kaseya. So third-party risk management, clearly a problem that clearly nobody has a good model yet. At least I don't think so. Feel free to tell me if you think I'm wrong. Is that a space where there's some innovation to be had here? Is that a problem that's tackleable with technology?
I think so, because it is not a supply chain. It is a supply mesh. It's a supply ecosystem. There are interdependencies all over the place. And so I think, if you want to work on dependency mapping and places where you can consolidate some kind of governance or compliance efforts within shared, and heavily dependent or linchpin vendors, that's certainly an opportunity.
So one of the buzzwords of the era is zero trust. but we don't apply the concept of zero trust to our vendors. We actually trust our vendors and the responses that they give us in the questionnaires. Those customers that chose to not have trust in SolarWinds and bounded the conditions upon which it can operate had a compromised SolarWinds Orion instance, but did not suffer the impact of that. And I think there's a tremendous lesson learned here in terms of how do you create those guardrails, a zero trust mindset of a vendor product, so that I know exactly what it's supposed to do and nothing else is allowed. And I was having a conversation this morning with one of my former colleagues, and that's essentially a DMZ, but one that is hard for us to implement and design because those things are ever-changing and very dynamic. So an opportunity here is really to say, how do I apply the principles of zero trust, but make that so much easier to implement and orchestrate and automate so that defenders can easily apply zero trust to their vendors as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is absolutely a ton of innovation that can happen here. And I'll go back to what I said earlier about the convergence between compliance and risk. A lot of the third-party risk activities are today driven by compliance, right? You have to audit your vendors, you have to do a certain amount of risk assessments, periodically, and those are kind of very much checkbox items that you send out the vendor questionnaire, you get the response back, and you shelve it somewhere. The ability to actually measure the real risk of a third party doesn't really exist yet, right? So the ability to continuously verify what you think the vendor said they do in a real world environment, or the ability to get real-time alerts when a vendor is down, which is also a risk, a security risk, but also an operational risk. Like that doesn't really exist today. And I think the company or product that will solve third-party risk is the one that's going to be able to leverage what's happening on the compliance side while actually capturing the risk element of it.
Yeah. I think the point about it's just a checklist of checkboxes is important. If your company is given one of these questionnaires, the important thing is to say yes to every question, because the only thing, they don't just get put in a box. If you say no, somebody wants to know why their pet control wasn't satisfied. They don't care what you're actually doing. They just want a yes to their pet control. So let's talk a little bit about cloud, because I think we haven't been as focused on that, and I think there is some change to how people operate when they go cloud native or go cloud transformation. What do you see as the sort of coming challenges for companies in the cloud security environments?
At the companies I've been at, part of the challenge, leaving Google aside, was how do we avoid getting lock-in into the security layer of a certain cloud provider, right? And so you might choose to be on AWS first. Well, AWS has its own security model, and it doesn't always translate if you want to be on a multi-cloud environment. So I see the coming challenges as more people move workloads to the cloud. They want to have the ability not to be stuck in on one cloud provider, so we need security tools that abstract that layer, right? I think that's really key as you think about that.
Actually, I want to challenge that a little bit, because I don't know that I've found very many companies that have actually implemented multi-cloud. They all talk about it, like they want it, but the exact problem you're talking about is not just security controls, it's every control is bespoke to that cloud.
Yeah, I think there's two sides to that. One is we may not know that there's a shadow IT group that's implemented something, right? And if we include SaaS in that, it's even bigger. And I think the second thing is they may not realize that there's tools available and they're stuck. They hire people to be AWS security experts in their company. Well, you want to have the ability to move outside of AWS if you want to for cost reasons, and they feel stuck.
So I think that problem space is a mirror of what we see, for example, in Windows and Mac. It'd be wonderful if everyone just used Macs or everyone just used Windows, but life is not like that. Life is not as simple as that. Just as much as we want endpoint management tools that can abstract out the differences between the two OSs, we're going to have that constant challenge when it comes to multi-cloud. Now, the problem is also we have monocultures, right? There's a whole bunch of dangers in having a monoculture, Windows being a monoculture. But we also have potential threat vectors that we have to account for if we have one orchestration system that covers all our tools, right? So if there's one orchestration for all our cloud, then we're creating we're creating potential attack vectors that lose the benefit of actually the diversity that we might want. So there's a trade-off, and I think ultimately that trade-off is something that a business has to commit to saying, you know what, we may have to have two sets of people that understand two different cloud environments, because that's what we need from a resiliency standpoint.
So Ariel, I want to toss this one to you relatedly, which is how should a startup be thinking about a multi-cloud strategy, both as a consumer of cloud, but certainly if they're in the cloud security space? What are the things you tend to look for that says this is a company that understands cloud and multi-cloud in the environment?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So as a consumer of cloud, I look very skeptically at companies that say that they are running on multiple clouds, because that likely means that they've overinvested in their infrastructure. Because as a young startup, you rarely have the resources or time, until you get to a much later stage, to be consumer of multiple clouds. In terms of supporting multiple clouds, that feels like that's table stakes. You're not going to be able to have a scalable company if you're only going to pick one cloud ecosystem. And so you have to, it's perfectly fine to start from one, and typically you start from the biggest one, which is AWS, and then you go to Azure, and then you go to GCP, because that's kind of where they rank. But there has to be the ability to support multiple clouds. And there, as you know, there are many customers who refuse to run on certain clouds. Particularly if they're in e-commerce and they don't like Amazon, right? So you have to be able to, at some point, run on multiple clouds, and from early on to support multiple clouds, but very dangerous to do from day one.
So earlier, Ryan made a great comment about looking for solutions that covered multiple things, broad-based security solutions. But sometimes we see success in very narrow focus things. And I think Duo was probably a great example of did one thing amazingly well, and so Cisco bought you. So how do you now look across companies, your own portfolio, between balancing do several things really well so you can replace solutions versus find a niche that nobody has yet nailed and do that one better than everybody else?
I think that more than just looking at what is, best of breed, or, if you're looking to add something to a portfolio, it's more, and this is harder to describe, but it's important to look at the way they think about the problem and whether it aligns with the way you think about other problems. And I find that thought process is going to play out in the design and the implementation of an offering, and at that point you can say, is this going to be compatible with what I want to do? I think it's the more abstract compatibility that is important, rather than something just being really, really good. If you can't integrate it into your portfolio, it's not going to be good for either side.
So when I was at Bank of America, I asked a whole bunch of companies, security companies, I want platforms, not point products. What do you think happened?
You got a lot of point products at Bank of America, if I recall.
All of a sudden, all those point products are now platforms. All right. At the end of the day, if you're a VC, you want them to sell product, not platforms. As a buyer, I want platforms, not point products. And there's a tension there that I being at YL, I had trouble resolving. I kept telling Ofer and John, I need platforms, and I want specific. I don't. Having a startup focus on a specific problem, while nice and can go deep, as a buyer, if I have a whole bunch of point products, I have to integrate them, and the integration is a huge challenge. So, you startups, if you're gonna have a platform mindset but still have to build product, that's great. Just have a mindset of how am I going to integrate with all these other products so that I don't have to do that for myself.
Yeah, that's not so much of a conflict in my mind. Like when I hear companies at an early stage say that they're selling platforms, that's a pretty fast disqualifier. Because as much as you wanted platforms at Bank of America, I don't think people buy platforms, because you're gonna buy a specific product that solves your need, and what you want And what you want to see in a startup is that they build a product that addresses, a killer need that has the opportunity and the potential to then be expanded into multiple offerings in similar ways that can be, eventually expanded into a platform. And then you get your platform when you grow up. Because I think
I end up with multiple overlapping platforms.
Yeah, well, the way I think about it is, if you're successful with the product, you're given the option and the opportunity to build a platform, but you can't get there unless you have the first.
Yeah, you're too young to be a platform. Wait until you grow up.
So we've covered a lot of buzzwords already, so I'm going to throw in another one, which is DevSecops. Is DevSecops even... Yeah, shift... Oh, come on, you're one question ahead of me already. So I think we talk about shift left, we talk about DevOps, and to me, DevOps is often just ought to be, make the developer realize how badly they've screwed up operations so that there's a fast life cycle that they can fix it. That's not always what developers want. How do you see the space of DevSecops? Is that a space of its own right? Is it just security engineering applied to DevOps? How do you think about that space?
I'll take that. So the hardest folks to recruit in security, in my opinion, are people that are deep in application and product security, right? We're all fighting over that same talent as CISOs. So it's also the area that some CISOs aren't always comfortable talking to developers, right? You might not be a coder yourself, believe it or not, as the CISO. And so this idea of shift left and DevSecOps, I think it's just empowering and enabling some tools to go have good conversations and allow the developers to govern themselves. As the CISOs, you allow the policies to be created, you come up with the policies, and then the tool set will help drive those policies to an action, and you'll be able to monitor that. And so I like the idea of shift left and DevSecOps, but it's ultimately empowering the developer with you to be able to provide some oversight.
Yeah, I think some of this is pretty funny because back in the olden days, a sysadmin would do all the layers. They would address everything from pulling cables to helping to troubleshoot software. So they did everything. And now that DevSecOps is trying to smush that back together again, I'm finding that there are a lot of developers who, call themselves full stack, but if you go to them and say, "Can you pull this cable?" they're like, "Well, no, not like that." So I find that they are pushing a lot of operations onto SREs, and I think SREs are going to be the new ops for everything that the developers never really wanted to address, to begin with.
I think it's an evolution that's been, in the making for decades. Developers used to only write software. They didn't test their software. You had QA for that. Then developers realized that, they should probably be doing unit tests and testing, and so developers started testing as well, and so QA kind of got folded into development. Then we got SaaS, and then developers had to be responsible for what happens in the runtime of their software, because before that you used to have sysadmins that did it all for you. So then you got DevOps, which is developers starting to think about and care about the operations and how it actually performs. Okay, so that happened. And now security, security is a separate function, but a lot of what needs to happen to secure software needs to happen at development time. And so developers are now being tasked with those responsibilities, so DevSecOps. I think it's just lower and lower layers of responsibility that kind of keep getting pushed into developers, as well they should, because that's the lowest cost place to fix them. I don't think it obviates the responsibility of any of the other functions, but it certainly changes them, right? Like sysadmins become SREs. Security operations and engineers become, something other than actually securing code.
So I have a team of 4 people now, supposed to go to 6. Out of 70 people, it's a pretty good number ratio-wise. All of us know how to develop. So there is no DevSecOps. We're all part of the same development team. And I think that, in terms of how people would sell to us, you have to sell to us as if we are developers. And I think that's what's going to make DevSecOps, this whole notion of DevSecOps actually work.
So I want to bring it back to the automation question, though, because Ariel just suggested, or maybe I'm reading between the lines, that there's sort of a way to take technology directly to the developer. And so you can replace that security engineer with DevSecOps technology, or maybe you can augment. but often that's a space we were failing at before the DevSecops world. Engineers built stuff, and then security discovered it was broken in production. And if we're trying to get that fix earlier, we don't have a model that works. But earlier we said, oh, when you build tools and you automate, you should be tightly scoped. So how do those challenges resolve each other? And what should companies be looking at to make this a successful space?
That's a great question. I don't know that I have a good answer, other than to say that a lot of the companies that I've seen in RASP and in DAST are trying to do a lot of that vulnerability detection in code earlier in the process, where they'll allow developers to run unit tests that will also see if they can highlight vulnerabilities, and you can scan all of the software and the open source components that you're using in order to identify potential vulnerabilities there before they ever make it into production. So I think it's happening in very specific, discrete use cases. It's not a panacea that you're all of a sudden going to have developers writing secure code, which is why I don't think you're going to get rid of the security engineers. You still need that audit function and that that certification function. But as you discover more and more failure patterns, you can then build those into the process and the workflow in order for developers to fix it.
I'll offer a counter to that, which is speed trumps security. So there's a concept that we have embraced recently called moving target defense, which is have your environment change so frequently that the attackers have to keep up and not the defenders. If the defenders are having to keep up with the development teams, then we'll lose anyway. But if we can, as the security team, if we can actually help accelerate the business, they become that moving target that makes it a much harder target to be able to compromise. So I could, for example, have a vulnerable piece of software using vulnerable code base, but if that code base changes daily, very fast, then I would have a greater confidence that that's going to be harder to attack than one where it's moving slowly because I've implemented a whole bunch of security controls that slows down the business. It's a trade-off, and again, it's a counterpoint, but one that I would argue I would rather invest in speed, and as a security team, I would rather invest in speed than slowing down the team purely for the sake of security.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. I don't think that you need to. That's a false trade-off.
Sometimes false trade-offs are the only trade-offs we get. In a few moments, I'll be taking questions from the crowd, so you can start thinking about what topics we haven't yet addressed. But before we get to that, we've got some first-time entrepreneurs here in the crowd. So what are the things that first-time entrepreneurs need to do to stand out or don't need to do because they don't necessarily have a reputation as an entrepreneur yet? And so when you're working with a startup, how do you approach that?
Are you meaning what the startup needs to do?
Yeah, to distinguish themselves in your eyes so
Yeah.
that you're willing to do a design partnership or take a risk on this business.
Yeah, I think it's really key, like in the presentation that you do, you only got about 5 minutes before the CISO starts tuning out, frankly. And so having a really tight presentation, not talking about all your accolades, but getting down to what the problem space is and what your innovative solution is super key for me. And then we can have that discussion, and then we can get into diagramming. But I want to know that you understand the problem.
Yeah, I mean, the funny thing is that it's exactly the same answer from an investment standpoint. Is when I hear 10 minutes describing here's the market size and the opportunity and why this is a 20% CAGR that will be 30 billion 10 years from now, like it's already lost. What I need to understand is exactly what is that pain point for the buyer that's being solved and how you're going to solve it in a way that's different from everybody else and different from the incumbents that are there. And if you can do that succinctly, then...
I was going to say, and I'm going to say this again on Wednesday, so you can skip my talk on Wednesday at Cyber Week. But are you trying to solve a problem or are you trying to capture a market? Because those are two very different things and they can often come in conflict, especially as you look to the future towards going public. If your pitch is around, we're going to capture this much of the market, what trade-offs are you going to have to make business-wise to be able to do that? So on the other hand, if you are trying to solve a problem, you have the luxury of focusing on it for a long time for years if you have to be able to come up with that. But just be able to describe that when you come to the table, which of those two things you're trying to do, and don't try to say both.
I might present a counterpoint to that, which is that unless you're solving a problem, like whatever your plans are for capturing a market are pipe dreams. Like you have to be able to show why why the buyers are going to buy you today, right? Rather than why you're going to be a $1 billion company a year from now.
Yeah, that's fair. I just find that a lot of pitches tend to conflate the two. And they're making trade-offs in their design that are geared towards, okay, we want to optimize our go-to-market.
Right.
Yeah, the pitch that you use to sell yourself to a venture capital fund is not the pitch you use to sell yourselves to a CISO, right? You're selling to the venture capital fund, you'll have a market, and of course you have a product. The CISO doesn't care. They don't care that you're in Shmona Matayim. We all assume that because you're in Israel. We don't need 5 minutes on that.
Although I must say, after having served as CISO-in-Residence, I now have a deeper appreciation for all these other numbers, like 81, 7149, all these other, like, everyone just says, I'm 8200 because we Americans, we have no idea what you do. But now I actually know, and I think it sets a different bar. All that said, I've spoken with probably close to thousands of vendors just during my time at Bank of America and since then. I love learning, okay? And so if there's an opportunity for me to learn, then I would love to have that opportunity. And what I found to be most useful in learning is whatever experience you've come away with in serving in 81, 7149, 8200, blah, 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 if there's something novel there, teach us that. That's really fascinating for us.
That's a really good point, Sounil. I like that. Yeah, every CISO loves to learn, although many of them don't like to be taught. So you have to be careful about walking and saying, I'm going to teach you this thing.
Yeah, no, they don't try to tell them their job.
Okay, so one last question before we go to the audience participation. As a startup, a lot of times you're looking for a design partnership with one or more of your customers. But what are the red flags that they should watch out for, the startups, in talking to a CISO who's like very excited about a design partnership, but this is not going to be a good relationship for the startup? What are your red flags?
If it's Bank of America, you got to be careful. No, I'm kidding. Kidding, not kidding. If it's very large, institutions that move at glacial pace that will take 24 months to make a decision, they might not be the best design partner because you'll build something that's specific for their needs that might not be useful for the broader market.
Yeah, and then the other side of that is if they're really small and high growth, they may not be able to put the resources at it to see it through the right way.
Sounil does not want to take that one.
Oh no, I 100%. Bank of America, any large bank is not a good design partner.
Thank you all for coming out tonight. Enjoy the party and meet some people.